Totenberg talks about President Clinton, Kenneth Starr, and impeachment. Before the Texas governor's debate gets underway, we'll find out how the race is developing from political analyst Charlie Cook.
The Texas gubernatorial race features George Bush seeking re-election as a governor of Texas, and his Democratic challenger is Land Commissioner Gary Morrow. This is a race that most of the political handicappers have decided is over before it's begun. Bush's poll numbers 4 months have been out of sight. He appears to be hugely popular, but more than that, even in the middle of the summer, he had over $14 million in the bank. Most of the big-name Democrats who were mentioned to possibly take him on decided against it. Remember, he knocked off Ann Richards 4 years ago in what many people thought was a surprising upset, because Richards was wildly popular. But, you know, this shows you 4 years ago was a good Republican year, and it also shows you the kind of state Texas is with its core Republican vote. Now, a number of big-name Democrats, including the outgoing Lieutenant Governor, are supporting Bush. Bush has great support. Obviously, all Republicans are behind him. The Democratic challenger, Morrow, has raised only a couple of $1 million. He's a populist Democrat, a fighter, very aggressive, good campaigner, good reputation for putting together grassroots campaigns, on-the-ground campaigns with volunteer, door-to-door field operations. He just doesn't have enough money. He's arguing that, that Bush isn't responsible for the economy, that other factors have boosted the Texas economy. It's not George Bush. He's complaining about education. But this is one of those cases where the Democrats are running against a just very popular Republican in a Republican state, in a national election where the tide has turned a little bit against the Democrats. And somehow Morrow has to pierce that notion of invincibility about George Bush. And as Bush gets more and more Republican and Democratic endorsements, that's difficult to do. So part of the attention right now is on down-ballot races in the state. The lieutenant governor's race was supposed to be competitive. Democrats were hoping to pick that off, maybe an attorney general's race. The big focus is George Bush going to run for president in 2000. And one of the questions is, how well does he do here against Gary Morrow, and admittedly a guy who doesn't have a chance of beating him, but how much can he run up the score against Morrow? And I think that may tell us something about 2000 as well.
Recently I went to a juvenile justice facility. I was pleased to see that the entire culture of the juvenile justice system has changed from one of saying to the children, it's really not your fault that you committed the crime, to one that says you're going to be held accountable for your behavior. The heads were shaved. The children were in jumpsuits. The children got up early in the morning in a very disciplined environment. And I asked them questions about gangs and guns and drugs. The most compelling story of all was a young man who looked at me, and after all the discussion, he said, "What do you think of me?" It broke my heart to think that here is a person that doubted in the greatest state in the United States as to whether or not he had a shot. And I assured him he had a shot if he understood that there are right choices to make in life and wrong choices to make in life. He had made a wrong choice, but we were teaching him that there are right choices to make, and I'm confident that this young man is going to be able to go out in society, and if he works hard, and if he adheres to common values, he will succeed in the state of Texas.
On June 16, 1995, Governor George Bush vetoed your right to choose your own doctor. Governor Bush has never had to pick a doctor from an HMO list like we have, yet he sided with the giant HMOs, saying you already had enough choices. I'm Gary Morrow. The HMO should not have the right to tell you what doctor to use. I will put the right to choose your own doctor into the Texas Constitution. Bush is against it. To choose your own doctor, you need to choose a new doctor.
I want to thank the citizens of El Paso for your hospitality. The reason I chose El Paso as the site of this debate is because I wanted to show my fellow Texans that El Paso is an important city for our future. It's a good city, and there are good, decent people who live here. It's been my honor to be your governor the last 3 3/4 years, and I'm working hard to earn your support so I can be your governor again. I've shown the people of Texas that I'm the kind of fellow who does in office what I say I will do. If I say something, I mean it. I've shown Texans I know how to lead, that I'm a uniter, not a divider. I've shown Texans that I'm willing to reach out to both Republicans and Democrats to do what's right for Texas. I've got good relations with the Democrat Speaker, and the Lieutenant Governor, the highest-ranking Democrat official in the state, Bob Bullock, has strongly endorsed my candidacy. For that, Governor, I am grateful. I've shown Texans I'm willing to challenge the status quo if necessary. But most of all, I've shown Texans that I make decisions based upon core values. I don't need to take polls or run focus groups to know what I believe. I believe in limited government. I believe government ought to do a few things and do them well. I believe we ought to trust local folks to make the right decisions for schools, cities, and counties. I believe that private property is the backbone of capitalism, and families will lead to a more stable tomorrow. And I believe if we want to usher in the responsibility era, all government laws must say that each and every one of us in the state of Texas must be accountable for our behavior. The last 4 years have been good for Texas. We've laid the foundation for a better tomorrow, and now it's time to build. If I'm reelected, my #1 priority will be the school children of the state of Texas. I've got a plan to make sure that no child is left behind and every child can soar. In my balanced budget, I've got $1 billion for teacher pay, money for additional classrooms, and money for programs to make sure that every single child can read. I want to make sure the Texas business environment is still strong so that anybody in Texas can find a high-quality, high-paying job. I've got a plan for a more decent welfare system that as we move people from welfare to work, we do so in a compassionate way. And finally, I want to make sure our neighborhoods and streets remain safe. I've had a good record on criminal justice, and I will maintain that record so long as I'm your governor. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Morrow, you now have 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, Bob, thank you for having me here tonight. I want to join Governor Bush in thanking the folks in El Paso for having us out here. And I want to thank Governor Bush for agreeing to this debate. I think it's good for all Texans. You know, we all know about Governor Bush's family. I want to take just a second to talk about my family. You know, my great-grandparents were tenant farmers in the Brazos River bottom. My grandfather, well, he quit school in the 2nd grade because the teacher spoke English. He didn't. We didn't have bilingual education in those days. Well, I was born when my parents were finishing Texas A&M, and I worked my way through high school. Heck, when I went to Texas A&M, I had student loans. I made pizzas 3 times a week. I worked my way through school. I still can't look a pizza in the face because I got all I could eat for free. You know, when I got elected land commissioner, I put a sign on my door, and it says, "Do right and risk consequences." It's a Sam Houston saying. I'd like to think that I've done that slogan in everything that I do. Now, Governor Bush and I agree on a lot of things. He's a nice guy, but on making tough decisions, I think that's where he and I cross. The fact is, 4 years ago when he told us he wanted to end the parole of rapists and child molesters, I think he meant it, but he didn't do it. I'm telling you now, when I'm governor, we'll end the parole of rapists and child molesters. You know, as land commissioners, I've had to make a lot of tough decisions. When I was elected, we had a veterans program that was in disarray. I promised the people of Texas the best veterans program in the country. And that's what we've got. We've made $2 billion in loans to Texas veterans, and it is the best program in the country. When I got into the land office, I discovered that we routinely and institutionally were dumping garbage in the Gulf of Mexico from foreign ships. And then we had to stop our garbage dumping in the Gulf of Mexico. I worked to make an international treaty a reality and then amend that treaty to end the dumping of garbage in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of people said land commissioners couldn't make international law, but we did, and it is against the law. I worked hard for coastal management. When Governor Bush got elected, he was opposed to coastal management. He said somehow that was going to take away private property rights, and when he took office, he removed us from the federal program. But I wouldn't take no for an answer. I worked hard to make sure we had the best coastal management program in the country, and we do. Working with local officials, we are protecting our beaches for all time, for all Texans. You know, there comes a precise moment in time when leaders should have a good work ethic, the guts and the will to make tough decisions. I have a record of doing that. I think that's the difference between me and Governor Bush. I think we need to make tough decisions, and we need to make certain this state lays the foundation for the 21st century.
Thank you. We'll now move into approximately 45 minutes of questions. The first question deals with the border economy. Texas generally is enjoying a period of prosperity right now, but that prosperity is far from universal. when you look at per capita income, the 4 poorest counties in the country are all here on the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas: McAllen, Laredo, Brownsville, and here in El Paso. Under NAFTA, the border area is increasingly going to be key to continued prosperity in Texas. What specifically will you do in infrastructure, workforce development, and health care issues to ensure that the border can prosper with the rest of the state in the future? Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds in the first shot at this one.
Well, you know, working with border communities, I have a record, particularly here with El Paso. The fact is, we own 80,000 acres with the Permanent School Fund right here in this county, and I've worked to put a loop around the city connecting east and west El Paso. I've worked to make certain that the Diamond Shamrock gasoline facility had a place to locate. I opened an office here, made sure that we made loans here. When I took office, we'd only made 16 loans to El Pasoans. We've now made 3,600 loans to El Paso for $110 million. But all the things I've done at land office, well, they pale into comparison to what needs to be done in the border economy. The fact is, we need to deal with the equity issue in a very direct way. When I'm elected governor, I'm going to end the inequality of spending we have in the border economies. Historically, we spend less money per capita in our border areas than any part of our state. Now, Governor Bush has been in office 3 years and 9 months, and I'm sure he's going to have a great plan for us for the next 4 years. But when I've been in office 3 years and 9 months, we're going to have moved dramatically ahead to solve the NAFTA infrastructure problems. It only makes sense that we put more infrastructure in the border areas, and we're going to equalize spending, state spending, in our border areas when I'm governor.
Thank you. Governor Bush, you have 90 seconds.
Well, I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA, Bob, because I believe NAFTA is good for Texas, and I believe NAFTA is good for Mexico. I think it's important for us to have free and fair trade with Mexico. A good Mexico is good for Texas. To specifically answer your question, I support tax enterprise zones. I look forward to working with Senator Sibley on putting a tax enterprise zone package together so that border towns that may have not benefited fully from NAFTA, like El Paso, will be able to attract industries. I believe in work programs. I worked closely with the mayor and Congressman Reyes recently to land the El Paso PREP money, $45 million of displaced worker money, to make sure that those workers that may have been passed by NAFTA trade will have meaningful training so that they can find meaningful work. Recently, the Texas Department of Transportation approved money for Loop 375. I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA highway money coming down to not only El Paso but all the border. I've worked closely with Senator Hutchison and Senator Graham on the new ICE-T funding formulas to make sure that Texas got its fair share of money, so that as NAFTA traffic increases, there will be increased infrastructure available for Texas. I believe NAFTA is good. I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA, and I will continue to be a supporter of NAFTA so long as I'm the governor of this state.
I've got a couple of follow-ups for each of you on this. Commissioner Morrow, you mentioned the equity issue in general, but I'm really interested in specifics. What sort of specific programs would you propose for the border area to address the equity issue?
Well, first of all, we have got to get our colleges up to equal spending. I mean, the fact is, I think UTEP is 35th out of 35 college in a per capita spending for students. That has got to change. If you look at Pan American, University of Texas Pan American, you look at Texas A&M, Laredo, we have got to make a strong commitment, not talk during election years, but a strong commitment to putting real dollars in the border areas and make it work for the people of all of Texas.
Thank you. Governor Bush, along those same lines, in the 1994 campaign, you criticized Governor Richards on the equity issue and felt that she had left quite a few disparities in funding from state spending on the border. In a September 1994 article in the Dallas Morning News, you were quoted as saying, "State funding decisions should be based on need and economic common sense rather than politics." But in examining funding for the state Smart Jobs program, during your term, almost 45% of the grants from that program have gone to Dallas, which has unemployment in about the 5% range, but only 3% went to El Paso with 12% unemployment, and 6% went to South Texas counties where the unemployment is 18%. How do you square those statistics with your promise in the last campaign to base it on need, not politics?
I just described, Bob, my efforts to get $45 million from the Department of Labor specifically targeted to El Paso. It's called El Paso PREP. It's federal monies that will be in place to help displaced workers become available for new jobs. And so I've worked hard for El Paso to make sure El Paso is treated well. Same with the highway money. I've got a good record in terms of El Paso, and I will continue to have a good record in terms of El Paso so long as I'm the governor.
Moving on to the next question, this is a question I feel somewhat obligated to ask, although it's become sort of a distraction in the governor's race. But much of the attention during this election has been focused on another election in 2 years, specifically whether Governor Bush may seek the presidency in the middle of his term. Now, Governor Bush, I'd like you to address your plans in 2000, but more broadly, I'd like both candidates to discuss whether Texans who elect someone to office have a right to expect them to serve their full term.
Well, Bob, I've been somewhat amazed by the speculations. I'm sure you have as well. I chalk it up to the fact that I'm the governor of a big state, and I've got a famous mother. When I asked the question about whether or not I was going to seek the presidency a year ago, I told the truth. I don't know. I could have been one of these types of politicians that said, well, no, I promise not to run, and then turn around and run. But that's not the way I am. I don't know whether I'll seek the presidency or not. I told the people of Texas when I said that, if that bothers you, when you go into the voting booth, then make that part of your consideration. I understand the consequences of not making up my mind. I'm conflicted by the fact that I worry about my family. I love my wife. I got great twin daughters that mean more to me than anything. I simply hadn't made up my mind whether this is something I want to pursue. But I'll tell you what I will do. I will be here to get a legislative agenda that I hope we talk about tonight through the legislature. I'll give a state of the state that will be optimistic and hopeful for Texas. And finally, let me say that I don't think there'd be all this speculation going on if the people didn't think I was doing a good job as governor.
Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds.
Well, you know, I think I'm like a lot of Texans. I've applied for a lot of jobs over my career, and one of the things you expect to do when you fill out a job application is you check a box. You say whether you're going to run for a full-time office, you're going to take a full-time job, or you're looking for a part-time job. I respect Governor Bush's indecision, but when you're running for the second largest state in the union, and when we have such a unique opportunity in history, I really think Governor Bush ought to speed up his decision-making process and tell the people of Texas where he stands. I mean, the fact is, he is running for a job that most Texans think is a full-time job. And I'd like to see him let us know. Is he going to be a part-time governor or a full-time governor? I know this, we have full-time problems in this state, and I have a plan to deal with those full-time problems. I want to build more schools. I want to pay our teachers. I want to give Hope scholarships. I want to make our neighborhoods safer. I've got a plan that puts Texas families first and takes advantage of this precise moment in time where the economy has given us a unique opportunity in Texas history. And I'm not sure we'll have that same opportunity with Governor Bush, because we don't know if he's going to be a full-time governor.
While we're talking about the national scene, I'm going to throw out one more follow-up question. It's a national level question, and then we're going to spend the rest of the night talking about Texas. The big story on the national scene right now involves the future of the president, who's a good friend of yours, Commissioner Morrow, and who's had some experience with your family, Governor Bush. Just wondering, from both of your perspectives, has what the president's been accused of, or does what the president's been accused of warrant his removal from office? Commissioner Morrow, 30 seconds.
Well, y'all all know that Hillary Clinton introduced me to Bill Clinton in 1972, and I've got to tell you, when all these charges came out, and when it turned out the president had lied to the American people, I was mad. I think he let us down. But I have now looked at the Starr report. I've watched the tapes. It's my opinion that President Clinton has done nothing that I can't forgive as a friend, nothing that is impeachable, and I think it's time we get beyond this circus we're having in Washington and start dealing with problems of ordinary Texans.
Governor Bush, 30 seconds.
Well, anytime you mention president impeachment in the same breath, it's serious business. I'm willing to give the president his day in court before I rush to judgment. I think most Texans feel that way as well. Like the commissioner, I'd like this to get over with as quickly as possible.
Okay. Now we will move on to the business of Texas. And probably the most important issue in this campaign, I think, from both campaigns' perspectives and from the people I talked to, has been education. So I'd like to devote the next few minutes of the debate discussing some ideas about improving education in Texas. Let's talk first about teacher pay. Commissioner Morrow has proposed an across-the-board $6,000 pay raise for Texas teachers to bring them to the national average. Governor Bush, as you mentioned in your opening statement, you proposed making about $1 billion available to local school districts to use for pay raises or for other issues they may see fit. I'd like each of you to explain to voters how your plan will improve student performance and why you think your opponent's plan might fall short of that goal. Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds on that one.
Well, you know, in 1984, we created education reform in this state, and it had three components. We were going to pass a class size law for the first time. We weren't going to have more than 22 kids in a classroom. We're going to raise teacher salary to the national average, so in fact we'd keep the best teachers in the classroom. And then we were going to hold teachers and students, and yes, school districts accountable. Well, 14 years later, we don't enforce our class size law, and teacher pay is dropped to 38th. You know, when Governor Bush took office, it was 36th. Now it's 38th. That's the wrong direction. I believe we have to recommit ourselves to the basics. I believe, first of all, we have to build enough schools so we can enforce our class size law. I have a plan to do that, put $2 billion into school construction. I picked $2 billion because that's what the TEA says we need to spend if we want to enforce our class size law. When I announced for governor, I said I wanted to spend $5,000 a teacher because that's where we were behind the national average. But in the course of this campaign, we're now $6,000 behind the national average. If we want to keep the best teachers in the classroom, if we want to eliminate this teacher shortage crisis we're in the middle of, we need to move to at least the average, national average. You know, think about it. We started at 36 3 years and 9 months ago. We're at 38th now. I want to take us to 25th, not to number 1, not to number 10, but to 25th in the nation. Governor Bush doesn't support that. I think he's wrong.
Governor Bush, 90 seconds.
I support teacher pay. I've got a realistic plan. First of all, I've got a balanced budget. I think it's important to have a balanced budget. And during the course of this discussion, I want it to be known that Commissioner Morrow's made $14 billion worth of promises. We only got $8 billion worth to spend. I think it's really important that we send money to local districts because that's where the decisions are made. There's over 1,000 districts in the state of Texas. The teacher issues in El Paso are significantly different than they are in Texarkana. I think it's important to send money to the decision makers. That's why I've got $1 billion in my budget to give local school boards the flexibility to make the important teacher pay decisions. One size should not fit all in the great state of Texas. Secondly, I've got $2 billion in my budget to replace property taxes that have been used in many cases for teacher pay. Texas is doing well in education. Our test scores are way up. The teachers are working hard. School board members are engaged. Plus, we've got a good system. We've limited the role of the state to two functions. One is to set clear and measurable goals, and secondly is to measure. But we've aligned authority and responsibility where it belongs at the local level. The best way to have innovation and change is to have high standards set at the state and to give people the flexibility necessary to make the decisions that they need to make to meet the local needs. I hope we talk about how we're going to make sure every single child will read. You see, I believe that the idea of moving 40,000 students through our system who can't read is bad for Texas, and I've got a plan to solve that.
As a follow-up, the governor anticipated one of my follow-up questions for you. There has been the criticism that you're sort of over-promising the budget here. Governor Bush mentioned, I guess now about a $6 billion deficit between what you promised and what's going to be available. How do you balance your budget based on your plan?
You know, Bob, that's simply not true. You know, 23 years ago, when I was 27 years old, Bob Bullock named me Deputy Controller for the state of Texas. Two of my responsibilities were to oversee revenue forecasting and funds management. I know the budget process backwards and forwards. My budget balances. No amount of political rhetoric will change it. My budget balances. And if we want to have a press avail after here where Governor Bush and I can sit down and I can show him how it does and he can show me where he thinks it doesn't, we can spend a full hour talking about priorities and how my budget balances right now.
Governor Bush, we won't
address
wait till the press availability afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. What happens during the course of a campaign, candidates go out and they make a promise here and they make a promise there and they forget to total it up. And so I totaled it up. But it wasn't just me. I called upon the Comptroller's office, the office that Commissioner Morrow used to work for, and asked their opinion. I talked to Rob Janelle, who's the Democrat chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I talked to Bill Ratliff, the Republican chairman of the Senate Committee, all of whom agree that this man, unfortunately, has outspent the amount of money available by $6 billion. And so what I'm going to ask during the course of this discussion is, are you going to raise taxes, or who's not going to get the money?
We'll move along to a related theme, and I think the budget may come up with this again, too. Many school districts across the state, in addition to dealing with some of the overcrowding problems you mentioned, are dealing with crumbling infrastructure as well. The El Paso Independent School District alone has almost $250 million worth of deferred maintenance on its school buildings. What do the candidates propose to do to help school districts deal not only with growth, but with deterioration of existing facilities? And Governor Bush, you have 90 seconds.
I'm a strong supporter of what we did during the last legislative session. Both Democrats and Republicans came together and permanently put in our budget $200 million a year to help local districts defease bonds floated at the local level. That $200 million will pay for interest and principal so long as there's any outstanding bonds, and that money yielded about $3 billion worth of bonds. My plan is to add another $200 million to the budget, so there'd be an additional $3 billion plus. This is the most effective way to make sure that local districts have the money to meet infrastructure needs. Now I want to say something about raiding the permanent school fund. The permanent, which is Commissioner Morrow's plan. The permanent school fund is called the Permanent School Fund because the principal is meant to go untouched. It is meant to remain intact. The school children of Texas live off the interest, and the idea of selling assets or leveraging the school fund is bad public policy. It won't happen, and also it requires a constitutional amendment to do that. And so I think my plan, one that both Democrats and Republicans have worked on, is a good plan for Texas.
Commissioner Morrow, 90 seconds.
Well, when I announced for governor, I listed a whole Texas Family First plan, and I went very specifically on what it would cost. My budget balance, we'll get a chance to talk about that later. But let's talk about school infrastructure. The Texas Education Agency says we need $2 billion worth of new classrooms if we're going to end overcrowded classes. They say we need to spend $1.8 billion building new classrooms, $200 million refurbishing it. I want to borrow that money just like we borrowed the $1 billion to build our prisons. Now, I did suggest, rather than sell bonds, we replace the bonds the school fund's already got in it. See, the school fund's fiscal policy says they buy 30% of their $18 billion worth of bonds every year. There are already $6 billion worth of bonds in the school fund. I'm just saying, why sell bonds the same day we're buying bonds? Let's cut the bond lawyers out. Let's cut Wall Street out. Let's pay the school fund as if they had bought a bond from the state of Texas, and let's pay it at the same rate of interest that they're getting from their current bonds. I think using the permanent school fund to build permanent schools makes good sense. I think maybe people don't understand that because it's a little complicated. I wouldn't think of raiding the school fund. You know, for the last 16 years, I've added $5 billion to the school fund. I've been involved in lawsuit after lawsuit protecting the school fund. I'm not raiding the school fund. I'm just trying to cut out the bond lawyers and cut out the Wall Street guys. And if we're going to sell bonds one day, why should we, and buy bonds the same day, why not buy our own bonds?
Governor Bush, as a follow-up to that, I guess what's wrong with borrowing money from ourselves, essentially, under this scenario?
Because the best way to do it is the way we're doing it, which is for the state to pay principal and interest. That's how you get money directly into the schools. And it's going to require more than $2 billion. It's going to require an additional $3 billion. We floated $3 billion worth of bonds the last biennium, and there's another $3 billion worth of bonds out there. And what he just described is, I'm no financial genius, but it was a little confusing, to be frank. I'm not exactly sure what you said. I do know there is a simple way of achieving the objective.
And Commissioner Moore, I was going to ask you, isn't there a more traditional way of doing this without running the risk of putting that money in jeopardy?
Well, the money's not in jeopardy. Let me explain. The school fund produces revenue for the permanent school fund. And then we have an investment policy. One of our policies is that 30% of the principal buys bonds. We do that routinely and regularly. We own bonds for Korea, for gosh sakes. I'm suggesting rather than sell bonds, we use part of that $6 billion we currently have invested in bonds from other states and other countries and use that money to build schools in Texas. I don't think that's very complicated.
An issue closely related to education is the funding issue. In the last session of the legislature, Governor Bush devoted a lot of energy to an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to overhaul the state's historic reliance on property taxes to fund public education. But there's been little talk during this campaign of property tax reform. If the school finance system was flawed in January 1997, isn't it still flawed today since we didn't fix it? What specific property tax reform measures would you advocate if elected or re-elected governor? And Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds.
Well, the first thing that I've done, very simply, if the state of Texas is building $2 billion worth of schools, that's $2 billion worth of schools and classrooms that local government doesn't have to float bonds for, so that will give real tax relief to those fast growth school districts that need the additional classrooms. The second thing I've talked about is it's really time for us to make certain that the state of Texas pays its fair share of education. You know, when I was working part-time in the legislature and law school, we were paying 80% of the cost of education from the state of Texas. It's now down to less than 45%. We've all set a goal for ourselves of 60%. I know Governor Bush supports that policy, as do I. But I think the way to do that is to seriously increase our funding from the state. That's why I've agreed to spend $2 billion on additional infrastructure growth, and that's why I want to fund a $6,000 across-the-board pay raise, take us to the national average. That'll be $3.1 billion added to the budget. That'll take us much closer to the 60% target we're all looking towards. Now, I'm looking forward to working to build a consensus for property tax reform. Governor Bush will tell you it's not easy, but it has to be done.
Governor Bush?
Yes, thank you, sir. But before I get to your question, I do want to say that if you try to run a $6,000 teacher pay through the current funding formulas, it's going to be a huge unfunded mandate on many districts, and it's going to cause property taxes to go up. Now, prior to my election in 1994, the state had not made the commitment of funding for public education. The state share of education was in the lower 40s. Now it's up to nearly 50% because we dedicated $4.7 billion additional dollars for school funding. I've got a plan to make sure that the state is the primary funder of schools. That's why I'm dedicating $3.6 billion of my balanced budget, additional money to go into public education. In terms of property tax, there's three ways to help. One, as you know, during the last legislative session, although I attempted for a much grander overhaul, showing Texans I'm willing to make bold decisions and be a bold leader, we did get a $1 billion property tax cut through the legislature, the largest tax cut in the state's history, increasing the homestead exemptions by $10,000 on every homeowner in the state of Texas. This may not have benefited a lot of the wealthier folks, but it darn sure helped the poorer Texans and it helped the elderly. Second, in my plan, I've got a $2 billion property rollback. In order for a district to access state money, there must be a dollar-for-dollar reduction in property taxes. And thirdly, I intend to raise the equalized wealth per district over $305,000 so that Robin Hood districts such as Austin Independent School District or districts in North Dallas, are not going to be put under Robin Hood status, thereby causing them to have to ship property tax money from their district to poorer districts. By raising the equalized wealth and by pumping $3.6 billion into the system, we can remove districts from Robin Hood status in Texas.
Commissioner Moore, I want to talk about, as a follow-up, the unfunded mandate issue. Is there a risk that if the state funds this one-time $6,000 pay raise, that after the biennium, then the school districts are going to be stuck picking up the tab for that?
That's absolutely baloney. The fact is, I clearly set aside $3.1 billion to fund the teacher pay raise. And the fact is, the way our budget operates, we're a function of how fast the economy is growing. Since World War II, we have not had a shrinking economy. It's always grown, sometimes not as fast as other times. It is not an unfunded mandate. I've heard the governor say it. It's just simply not true. No. I'm setting aside money to fund a $6,000 pay raise.
May I explain my position, Bob, please?
Explain it, but I have a quick follow-up, too.
Okay.
And it dealt with the $1 billion property tax cut the last time, in the last session, through the higher homestead exemption. I know in El Paso County and many other counties, that higher homestead exemption turned into a green light for school districts to raise property tax rates even higher. you can respond to Mr. Morrow's statement, but I'd also like you to talk about that.
Well, certain districts raised property taxes and certain districts didn't. My only point on that is that thank goodness we had an increase of $10,000 homestead for people. It softened the blow. Now, in terms of what I'm trying to describe to the Commissioner here, if you take the $3 billion and run it through the current funding formula, some districts are going to get enough money to pay the mandate from the state of Texas. A lot of districts won't, and they're going to have to raise their property taxes in order to meet the state mandate.
One last education-related question, then we'll move on to a couple more topics. While both of you have talked a lot about improving K through 12 education, there's been little talk during this campaign about higher education. Minority enrollment, especially in graduate programs, remains sluggish in the post-Hopwood era in Texas. What programs would you advocate to ensure better access to higher education for Texans? And Governor Bush, we'll start with you.
I signed the bill during the last legislative session and supported the bill that said if any student finishes in the top 10% of his or her class, they're automatically admitted into a state university. That's a good piece of legislation. It's a good piece of legislation because it says to children all across the state of Texas there is a reward for any in the top 10% of your class. I want to spend $18 million to expand the advanced placement program across the state of Texas. I can't think of a more noble objective than to demand the best from every single student. Right now, 33,000 students in the state of Texas pass advanced placement. My goal is for 100,000 students in the state of Texas by the year 2002 to pass the advanced placement. Here's the plan. There will be monies to train teachers on how to teach advanced placement programs. There will be money to help the students pay half the cost of taking the exam. And I've lined up Corporate Texas to provide bonuses for teachers whose children pass the exam. The best way for us to make sure that college is accessible is for us to challenge our students to be the very best they can possibly be. One quick point on University of Texas at El Paso. The Commissioner talked about adding money to UTEP. I do believe we ought to take UTEP from the PUF into the HEAF.
Okay. Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to start. I, of course, support higher education. I'm a graduate of two of our higher education institutions, Texas A&M and the University of Texas. But you know, we have really got to spend more money on higher education. And more importantly, we've got to figure out a way to make certain that we celebrate our diversity at these higher education institutions. I mean, the fact is, Texas A&M, University of Texas can't survive if they don't reflect our great diversity. I support additional scholarships, I support additional enrollment incentives, but the fact is 49 states in the union now qualify for affirmative action under the federal law. Texas is the only state that doesn't qualify for affirmative action. As governor, I'm going to make absolutely certain that we're not under an onus that limits our affirmative action any more than any other state. Right now, we're being treated unfairly, and I'm going to push hard to make certain we can reaffirm and reestablish affirmative action. I'd like to go back for just a second on the $1 billion tax cut. You know, when Governor Bush announced for re-election, he said, I gave Texans the biggest tax cut in history, $1 billion. Well, I've traveled the state of Texas, and that's a phantom tax cut. And now he wants to give us twice that much. Well, 2 times 0 is still 0. And I don't know anybody that got that tax cut. And the fact is, the reason local participation has increased so dramatically, yes, 68% of the school districts did raise their taxes, but in addition, our land values are going up so fast that most homeowners ended up paying more taxes even if they didn't raise the rate because their value of their home and their property increased so much. So that's why we aren't at 60%. That's why we're really not at 50%.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow. A follow-up question on that. A couple of weeks ago, the former chancellor of the UT system made some remarks about the state's treatment of its flagship institutions, and he thought one of the problems with Texas was that it doesn't invest enough in its flagship institutions. If you walk around this campus, you'll find a lot of people who will say we focus too much on our flagship institutions, and institutions like UTEP or UT Dallas or UT San Antonio tend to get left behind. What's your thought on that? Are we investing enough in higher education? Do we need more for flagships, more for the outlying campuses, Governor Bush?
I've got a fair amount of money in my budget for higher education increases. I do believe we ought to move University of Texas at El Paso from the PUF fund to the HEAF Fund. I think by being a part of the PUF Fund, which is kind of under the umbrella of the University of Texas at Austin, it's diminished their, it really hasn't meant that they've had fair funding and fair equity in the process.
Commissioner Morrow, your thoughts on that?
Well, as a graduate of Texas A&M and a graduate of the University of Texas, there's no doubt in my mind we have got to continue to invest dramatically in our flagship universities. But having said that, you travel the state of Texas and you know the universities that are spread throughout our state have got to be properly funded. I think we just have to make higher education a priority. I think we have to reform PUF one more time. I think we have to reform HEAF one more time. Now we got to be real careful because that's real politically sensitive, but everybody in the higher education business knows we've got to do better than we're doing now.
I'd like to shift gears here and talk for a little while about some issues that have particular interest to voters in El Paso, but I think also have substantial importance to all Texans. The first issue concerns the proposed low-level radioactive waste disposal site in Sierra Blanca, which is just east of El Paso. The Texas Natural Resource Commission will rule on October 22nd on whether to grant a license to the state to open the site, and it's possible that the commission may deny the license. It's taken us more than 15 years to get to this point, and we may have to start over again. I'd like your comments on how the process has worked over that entire period. We've focused a lot in this campaign on what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, but I'd like to look at the entire process and ask both of you if you think science has been the state's primary guide over the last 15 years, or has politics been allowed to intervene in the process? Commissioner Morrow, you have 90 seconds.
Well, of course, politics have played a role in where we put a nuclear waste dump. In fact, we have an administrative law judge of the TNRCC saying point blank in their decision that environmental justice, environmental racism played a role in the Sierra Blanca site being picked. I have a long record on this over those 15 years. I was elected Texas Land Commissioner in 1982. That was 1 year after Bill Clements created the Low-Level Nuclear Waste Authority. I was there when we rejected the Dale City site for bad geology. I was here when we rejected the Fort Hancock site for bad geology. In fact, the legislature passed a special law to force me to participate in helping test the Sierra Blanca site because they knew of my long-time advocacy for making absolutely certain we had good geology, making certain that we didn't create environmental justice problems, and I have long opposed the Hudspeth County site. But you know, in this particular site, the La Paz Agreement plays such a large role. Either the letter or the spirit of the law, the treaty with Mexico, is being broken. You shouldn't put a nuclear waste site within 18 miles of the border. We wouldn't want Mexico putting a nuclear waste site within 18 miles of the border. We need to move the site to a safe geological site that is not an affront to Mexico.
Governor Bush, you have 90 seconds.
Well, I've always said science ought to be the reason why you build or not build the site, Bob. My position has been firm all along. If it's not safe, it won't be built in Sierra Blanca. I can understand why the people out here in far west Texas are worried that this location has been dumped on their laps. It's been dumped on mine, too. I mean, in order to set the record straight, the people of El Paso who are concerned about this issue must understand that the bill that created this site was not signed by me, but was signed by Governor Richards, my predecessor. Governor Richards and Commissioner Morrow are close friends. And the only thing I would ask, Commissioner, is that you've made a lot of noise about this issue relative to me. Why weren't you making noise when Governor Richards had the issue? Surely you weren't playing politics with an issue as sensitive as this. Now, Bob, you're right. The TNRCC is going to make the decision on October the 22nd. These are 3 appointees who will make the decision based upon science, not based upon politics. And I look forward to seeing what their decision is.
Commissioner Morrow, I have a follow-up specifically for you, because you've repeatedly said that Governor Bush should instruct his appointees to the TNRCC to deny the license. If you're elected governor, I assume you'll appoint people to key positions because they have expertise in those areas. Will you tell those same people on key issues that their expertise is unimportant and they must follow your orders?
Well, in some cases, yes. I happen to believe our relationship with Mexico is so important that we shouldn't cite hazardous waste facilities, nuclear waste dumps within the border area, 100 kilometers of the border. I think that's wrong. And yes, I would tell my political appointees not to cite the Sierra Blanca site. But let me say something. Governor Bush challenged me directly. I thought that wasn't in the rules, but let me answer him directly. Dan Shelley, who was a state senator who has recently been on your staff, authored the bill that created the Sierra Blanca site. He came to see me. He said, we're going to pass a statute. We're going to make you help us test this site. I said, well, the only way you're going to do it is if you put it in the law, and they did. I have only followed the law reluctantly.
Governor Bush, I want to just address a specific question to you, and you can take some of your time to respond any way you want. But critics say that you've misled the public about the type of waste that's going to be stored at Sierra Blanca. I was reviewing some clips of appearances you made in El Paso, and you focused a lot of your talk about x-rays and gloves and things like that that will be disposed of there. But the TNRCC says that 80% of the or more of the waste that will be stored at Sierra Blanca comes from the nuclear power industry. Have you misled the public, or have you been misled in any ways by your advisors?
Well, there's certainly no attempt to mislead the public, Bob. My position has been and always is going to be, this won't be built if it's unsafe. Now, I'd like to address the issue of whether or not a governor should be interfering in ex parte communications with appointees when there's cases pending. Whether it be the TNRCC or the PUC, these people are sitting in judgment, and never should the governor intercede when people are sitting in judgment of a contested case.
The next El Paso-related issue I'd like to talk about is the ongoing issue of casino gambling in Texas, particularly as it applies to the Tigua Indians here in El Paso. The voters of Texas have legalized a state-run lottery, which some of the Indian tribes say opens the door for them to run Las Vegas-style slot machines on their reservation. Some lawyers for the state of Texas contend that these games are illegal. The question ultimately will have to be decided on the path we're going by the courts, which could take years, if not decades. What would you think about the idea of offering voters a constitutional amendment next year authorizing casino gambling only on the recognized Indian tribal reservations in the state? This would have the effect of allowing Texans to determine the outcome of the issue one way or the other, and perhaps bring a quicker resolution than waiting for years of legal decisions. Governor Bush, 90 seconds.
Well, Bob, let me first talk about the Tiguas before I get into a constitutional amendment. It's an interesting question. My job is to uphold the law. I don't get to pick and choose what laws to uphold. And my position is this: if what's going on inside the casino in any way, shape, or form is illegal, it ought not to happen. And I readily concede that there's a difference of opinion. Some people think the games are legal, some people think the games are illegal, and it is going to be solved by a court of law. I personally am against casino gambling in the state of Texas. I really haven't thought through what it would mean to have a constitutional amendment for a specific Indian tribe. I'm going to have to take a pass on that because I'm not sure what my vote or opinion would be. I will just tell you this: if the governor doesn't have a say in constitutional amendments. The only say the governor has is when a constitutional amendment's been passed by the House or the Senate and can vote as a citizen.
Commissioner Morrow?
Well, I think we finally found something Governor Bush and I agree on. I haven't thought of a constitutional amendment either, but I do believe that this issue ought to be resolved much sooner than that. I mean, this is really a sovereignty issue. I mean, the fact is, the Indian reservation, Tiguas, are a sovereign nation. The federal law clearly states that they can do anything the state of Texas can do. What they have done is pass a statute that is word for word with the Texas lottery statute, pass a statute that is word for word with the gaming statutes we have, and use those statutes to use random number generators, just like our lottery does, for slot machines. I mean, the fact is, what they're doing is no different at Speaking Rock than is done in any convenience store in this state. You look at Pick 3, you look at the Lotto, you look at the Cash 5, they all use random number generators, and they pay off as a result of what those numbers have generated, who the winners are. And that's all we do at Speaking Rock. You pull a number, the random number generator goes. The only difference is the state of Texas pays 45% back, and I think the Tiguas pay over 90% back. This is a sovereignty issue. I think it's time to read both statutes. If I'm right, let's leave them open. Let's sign a compact. They've offered to pay us 3% of their gross. Let's get some money into the taxpayers' pockets. Let's abide by the law.
Governor Bush, that raises an interesting point. Would you ever consider negotiating a compact with the Tiguas or the Kickapoos, for that matter, to better regulate what's going on and perhaps bring some revenue to the state?
I think the time to negotiate a compact is after the courts have decided one way or the other whether the gaming is legal or illegal. I agree with the Commissioner. I'd like to get it done as quickly as possible as well.
Okay. The next question I'd like to address has political importance, but perhaps is even more important to you in your role as parents. Last session, Senator West of Dallas was concerned about the increasing numbers of tragedies involving young drivers and introduced legislation to restrict late-night driving by 16-year-olds. Both of you have children that are either just coming into driving age or soon will be. That bill died in committee. Would you support legislation that would create a graduated driver's license program, giving teens more freedom as they gain driving experience rather than giving them all the responsibilities as soon as they turn 16? Commissioner Morrow?
Well, you know, Bob, this is my 5th statewide campaign, and I thought I'd been asked every single question I could possibly be asked. And you just asked me one I've never been asked. My guess is that my son David, who's going to be 11 in 2 weeks, and my daughter, who's 9, are against this. But I think we have to look at all of these safety bills that might cut down on deaths of teenagers. I mean, the fact is, this isn't the Texas I grew up in. When I grew up in Waco, you get a driver's license at 14. And Waco was a pretty small town, and there wasn't much danger in 14-year-olds driving cars. But today, if you look at Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, even the traffic here in El Paso, I wouldn't want my 16-year-old out driving late. So yeah, I'll look at those laws. I'll be very candid with you. I have not thought specifically about Senator West's bill, but I like the idea of aggressively pursuing options so that parents like me can feel much more comfortable when our kids leave the house.
Governor Bush, 90 seconds.
Our twin daughters are 16. There's not enough DPS officers in the state of Texas to protect my fellow Texans from these new drivers. I think the law ought to stay the way it is, first blush. I think where we ought to really crack down is on selling alcohol to teenagers. I've got a good man who's running the Texas Alcohol and Beverage Commission named Bud Shivers. His daddy was the governor of Texas. They're on the watch out for kids who are driving underage with alcohol. I really think that's the best place, Bob, to increase safety on the roads.
Related follow-up question, just to throw out real quickly, and this will probably be the last question for the evening. What do you think of lowering the state DWI standard from the current .10 to .08, Commissioner Morrow?
Well, I think both Governor Bush and I are on record as being supportive of that measure. We want to get people off the street that are intoxicated.
Governor Bush?
He's right. I'm for .08. Would have signed the bill last session. It died.
That wraps up the questioning portion of tonight's debate. We'll now go into the closing statements. They'll follow the same order as the opening statements. In this case, the candidates each have 2 minutes to summarize their position, and we'll begin once again with Governor Bush. 2 minutes, sir.
Bob, thank you. Commissioner, thank you very much. It's been my honor to be here. I'm working hard to earn your support for a second term. I think I got a vision for a better Texas. I've got a vision that says, a plan that says no child will be left behind and every child will soar when it comes to educating our children. I presented a balanced budget that has got teacher pay and more classrooms in it. I'm sorry we didn't get to spend too much time on criminal justice, but under my leadership, we have the lowest parole rate in recorded history. Texas is tough and Texas is fair. And under my leadership, we've reduced the welfare roll substantially by incorporating faith-based organizations as compassionate deliverers of welfare. Now it's time to ask for the vote. I'd like your help and I'd like your vote. A mis amigos hispanicos quiero decir eso. Muchas gracias por tu apoyo. Vamos a ganar. We're going to win. And thank you for your help. I'd like to conclude by quoting a great El Paso citizen and a friend of Laura and mine. His name is Tom Lee. Tom said, Sarah and I live on the east side of our mountain. It's the sunrise side, not the sunset side. It's the side to see the day that is coming, not to see the day that is gone. I love that sense of optimism about my friend, because you see, I see a day that's coming for Texas that's good and decent, a day full of hope and optimism. I look forward to being your governor again. I ask for your vote, and God bless Texas.
And now we'll conclude the debate for this evening with a 2-minute closing statement from Commissioner Morrow. Sir?
3 years and 9 months. That's how long Governor Bush has been in office. I'll ask you, if you can think of anything that he's done in 3 years and 9 months that was relevant in your life or your family's life, you ought to vote for him. But if you believe as I that we ought to put Texas families first, that this is a unique opportunity in our history, that we have significant additional resources and we ought to use them to put our families first, look at my plan. I want to build enough schools so that we can finally enforce our class size laws, making certain that no kid is in a classroom with more than 22 kids. I want to make sure that we keep the best teachers in the classroom. Let's go from 38th to 25th. Let's pay our teachers at the national average. I want to pay Hope scholarships. I want to give Hope scholarships to kids. I want to say if you'll graduate from college with a B average, B minus average, we'll pay your tuition and fees so you'll be trained to get the best jobs in the 21st century. When times are good, I want to see us set aside $500 million and tell local police departments and sheriff's departments, put community-based policemen in neighborhoods, and let's make them the safest places in the world to raise our family and live out our later years. I want to see us make certain that the HMOs and ordinary Texas citizens are on a level playing field. I want to make certain that doctors are making our medical decision, not bean counters, not accountants. I want to make certain that you have the right to choose your own doctor and you have access to the best cancer care in the world. And finally, I want to make certain that if we give a tax cut, and a lot of people are talking about it, they always do in good times, we eliminate the sales tax on cars, trucks, and vans. The fact is, we all drive to work. We all drive to work. That's a tax everybody can get the good consequences from, because we have cut that tax. And finally, I want to say this. I grew up in Texas. We're the proudest state in the Union. It's time for us to be the state that has the most to be proud of.
Thank you, Commissioner Morrow. That concludes our debate this evening. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and I'd especially like to thank Governor Bush and Commissioner Morrow for participating this evening. And I'll turn it back over now to Gary Warner.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Reminder for all of our Texas viewers, early voting begins on Monday, October the 19th. It concludes on Friday, October 30th. On behalf of the El Paso Times, the Dallas Morning News, KERA-TV, the Texas Association of Broadcasters, KCOS-TV, and KBIA-TV in El Paso, we hope this debate will help you make an informed choice, whether you cast your ballot during the early voting period or on Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd.
Our Campaign 98 coverage continues Sunday night on C-SPAN's Road to the Capitol. We'll feature a debate between Georgia's U.S. Senate candidates. Also, we'll show you a Wisconsin Senate debate. Road to the Capitol starts at 6 p.m. Eastern. Join us Monday night for more Campaign 98 coverage. We'll bring you a number of debates beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern with the candidates for Minnesota governor. Then at 9 p.m., a Florida Senate debate, and at 10, the South Carolina Senate debate. That's Monday night here on C-SPAN. You can get information on this fall's congressional and governor's races by accessing our webpage. We're at www.cspan.org. Coming up, comments from President Clinton and Democrats today.